First, live, local. This is Fox 12 Now.
Hello, I'm Greg Nibbler. This is Fox 12 Now, and if you're watching this show, I'm going to guess you have access to high-speed internet, but unfortunately, not everybody does. The digital divide, specifically between rural and urban communities, is real, and that can affect a lot of things. If you don't have access to high-speed internet, that could hamper business opportunities, educational programs, even healthcare access. A lot of things really depend on that, and here to talk about how Oregon is trying to bridge that divide, we're joined now by Nick Batz from the Oregon Broadband Office. And Nick, thank you very much for being here. And I think, for some education, just to start off, can you explain what your role is and what the Oregon Broadband Office is?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Greg. Yeah, like you said, my name is Nick Batz. I'm the director of the Oregon Broadband Office. I've been in this position for about five and a half months now. The Oregon Broadband Office is a relatively new creation. Governor Brown created it a few years ago via executive order, and then the Oregon legislature codified it about 6 months later. So we're relatively new. Up until about a year and a half ago, there was one person in the broadband office. So when you think broadband, you think this huge state investment in this giant team. There was actually one of us. There are now 8, and I'm the director of that office. We have folks who travel around the state and do outreach to communities and to internet service providers to understand kind of the gaps that exist and where we can plug in. We help individuals who lack access and are kind of at their wits' end on what they can do to get broadband service and to work with their ISP, to work with the FCC to make sure that their location or their address is accurately reflected on the broadband map. So that's what we're doing now. Additionally, we are preparing Oregon to receive a huge federal investment in broadband infrastructure. There are 2 big pots of money that are coming to Oregon. They're not coming as block grants. We actually have to apply for the funds and submit plans to the federal government on how we're going to spend those funds. That's what we're doing right now. It is a huge lift, and for the BEAD program specifically, it is an incredible amount of work.
Yeah, there's a lot of things you just touched on there. So let's go back to one of those, talking about that divide and people who don't have access. Do you have any kind of statistics on that of how many communities in Oregon or how many people do not have access to high-speed broadband?
I do, and it's a timely question. The FCC came out with version 2 of what's known as the National Broadband Map 3 days ago, and that has a number of updates to it from version 1 of the FCC's map. And the reason this map is important is Congress is requiring the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, otherwise known as NTIA. They are the administrator of the BEAD program. They are required to use this map when they determine how much funding each state gets. So it's very important that this map is accurate and reflects the true need in Oregon. So latest numbers, and looking down at my notes here, there are approximately 126,000 unserved Oregonians, or that's 8.4% of all eligible locations, and another 58,000 unserved Oregonians. That's 3.9% of all broadband serviceable locations.
That is a huge number of people that don't have access to that. So what are the attempts that are going on right now to try to bridge that? I mean, I suppose there's some different options that you could do, whether it's running wire, whether it's running cable or satellite. But what are the ways that the Oregon Broadband Office wants to tackle that?
I mentioned earlier, the federal government is fairly prescriptive on how they want states to go about tackling the digital divide. The first program and the first funding that Oregon will see is the ARPA CPF. It's known as the Capital Projects Fund, administered by U.S. Treasury. That is an infrastructure project around infrastructure funding. It's around $157 million that the state of Oregon will get, and it's primarily for infrastructure to communities who lack services below 100 megabits over 20 megabits per second. We are going to emphasize, we're going to dig down even further into that, and we're going to prioritize folks who have service below 10 over 1. So truly people who lack reliable high-speed broadband internet access. Is the federal government for both of their programs has a preference for fiber. So as much as the state can invest in fiber, that is what the feds would like us to see. But the challenge there is laying fiber optic cable into communities that currently lack it can get really expensive. If you've traveled around the eastern part of the state, which I'll do next week for a series of outreach meetings that we're hosting, there are communities that are really difficult to get to by car, let alone by fiber optic cable. So there will be a threshold. It's called the extremely high cost threshold, whereby we have to determine whether it makes sense to lay fiber to those communities or use some of the other options.
I mean, that's a lot of fiber to lay out there, as you just mentioned. I mean, and that would be tremendously expensive. So what about some of the other options that are out there? I mean, I know, Starlink or other satellite services along those lines, but something that could bridge that. Is that anything that you think they would consider?
It's an option. I don't think it's a preferred option for the federal government. I think there are communities where that might be the last resort, and that's what will make sense. But the option aside from fiber is our fixed wireless. So towers broadcasting signals into communities. And in part of the outreach efforts that we're doing around the state to understand both the assets that exist in Oregon, the gaps that exist, we're learning more and more about new technology that's coming online that internet service providers are deploying in Oregon, in other states, some of our neighborhood Pacific Northwest states, that fixed wireless towers that work better in terrain like we see east of the Cascades, where there's trees and there's hills and there's mountains. So that's exciting. It's something that we're going to look into, certainly. And I would be remiss if I didn't say the state of Oregon isn't going to own this infrastructure that we're going to build. We're going to be working with existing internet service providers and communities who through either public-private partnerships or those communities who want to start their own networks. So we're excited to see what responses we get back when these funds are available.
So talking about, just really quick, the technology that you mentioned there as far as the towers and exploring that, are you talking about something that would be over like a mobile network or an expansion beyond that?
Potentially mobile networks, but expansion beyond that. In these towers require fiber as well, so you can't just lay towers all over eastern Oregon and say it's good. You actually have to have fiber for the backhaul part of the network.
So regardless, fiber is going to be involved?
Yes, absolutely.
In some way, shape. What is the timeline for this? I want to go back to talking about the federal funding that you mentioned, the money coming in. What is the timeline for receiving that before you could start actually building or working on some of these issues?
There are two pots of funds. So the capital projects funds I mentioned earlier, the timeline on that is to be determined. We have some issues with Oregon statute, and it's currently, the broadband fund statute is misaligned with federal guidance, so we need to fix that to release those funds from Treasury. We're working with the legislature to do that, and that's a work in progress. There's a House Bill 3201B from Representative Marsh that would fix the issues. When that is resolved, we'll have a better understanding of when those federal funds are coming. The BEAD funds are a different animal. Those are the funds that are administered by NTIA. We have a series of deliverables before those funds show up. So the first step is what's known as the 5-year action plan. That is due from the state of Oregon to NTIA in mid-August. Following that is what's called the initial plan. And that is where we really show the feds what we're planning to do in Oregon and how we're planning to administer those funds. That is due to NTIA, I think, December 27th of this year. Once NTIA has signed off on that, it releases at least 20% of whatever the total allocation to Oregon is. So that would be the first time we get these funds, but we're not actually able to spend them at that point. They kind of go into an account to get us ready to administer programs. After we have approval of that initial plan, we're then required to file and produce what's known as the final plan. And that will lay out exactly how we plan to spend the full amount that NTIA is going to give us. My best guess on when those funds are released, sometime next year. It's really up in the air on how fast NTIA can get through all the documentation they're requiring of all these states.
So there's a lot of hurdles and not necessarily obstacles, but hoops to jump through, I guess, to get to this.
Yeah, yes, I would characterize it the same. It is so incredibly prescriptive. It's really difficult to kind of fathom. They released a NOFO last year, Notice of Funding Opportunity. It's hundreds of pages long, so complex that it requires a 100-page frequently asked question, of which there are now multiple versions, just to understand what's in that document. That is
Wow.
the guidance that the states have to follow to spend these funds.
And this is coming from the federal government?
Yeah.
Wow, 100-page FAQ.
Yeah.
I know you said you've been in this position for a few months. You're getting ready to go over to Eastern Oregon. But so far, what's the feedback that you've heard from people? Have you been able to speak to any of these communities in Oregon and hear what they have to say?
Yeah, we started our roadshow. I mean, they're officially known as community outreach events last week. And we started in Tillamook and ended up down in Klamath Falls and in Applegate community outside of Medford. There's tremendous interest in these funds. This is a once-in-a-generation funding opportunity. We're likely not going to see anything like it again. So it's fascinating to hear from individuals in communities who lack internet access and tell us the stories they face in trying to get service. Folks who can tell us that their neighbor a quarter of a mile down the street has fiber access, but it was too expensive to run it up to their house because they're the last house on the street. That is a frequent occurrence all over the country. Hearing from internet service providers who talk about the challenges they see in administering these programs. We're going to have a huge workforce challenge. I've had conversations with the governor's office. I met with the Higher Education Coordinating Commission today to talk through workforce challenges. There's about to be $50-some-odd billion spent on broadband infrastructure in the United States over the next 5 to 8 years. Every state is facing workforce challenges, and we're absolutely hearing that from our partners in Oregon. And then just there's excitement. Like, this opportunity hasn't existed before. Like I said, it's likely not going to exist again. So folks want to be engaged, which we love. We absolutely want to hear from people. We want to hear what their challenges are, what the opportunities are. So please reach out to the broadband office. There's a number of questionnaires we have that will feed into all this documentation we're required to provide by NTIA.
That's great. So they can go there and give some feedback, because I know even in parts of rural Oregon, you may have access to some cell phone coverage, but the internet's kind of spotty sometimes. You also have some of the satellite services, but then they put caps on them. I know that from personal experience. My parents actually have that issue, and there's no fiber lines run out there, and there's just no other option to get that high-speed access. So I'm glad that at least there's something maybe to look forward to that could tackle this.
Absolutely, and you hear from folks. We heard from somebody the other day who said when the wind blows too hard that their service doesn't work anymore. And we live in Oregon. We have just an incredible amount of trees of all varieties, and when those trees have leaves on them, that affects your service. And I tell other states that I talk to, other broadband offices that I speak with all the time, that we have a number of challenges in Oregon. We're a huge state to begin with. I think we're the 13th largest state, or thereabouts. We have topography challenges in that we have mountain ranges all over the place, and it's difficult to provide service through those mountain ranges. We have folks who like to live in the mountains because it's a beautiful place to live. That makes it difficult to provide service. We have the aforementioned trees, and then we have geology concerns. I live in Central Oregon and on the east side, and there's a couple feet of dirt and then lots and lots of lava beneath that. That is very difficult to dig trenches through, and that is an immense challenge in getting broadband in certain parts of Oregon.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. Your office definitely has a lot of work to do on that, and so I'm glad somebody's on it, though. I'm glad you're working on that, because this is obviously, as you mentioned, it's a huge issue. The one last question I'd had just about the technologies. Now, if you do run these fiber optic lines, even if it is to the towers, is that going to future-proof against, say, the next few generations or iterations of internet service, whatever that may be?
Yes, as much as you can, and I think that's why the federal government has a preference on fiber.
Yeah.
If you look at the history of internet speeds, and I mean, I remember when we used to get discs in the mail for AOL, and that's how you got your internet service, and dial-up and listening to the phone line dial in, and if you were able to download a picture over the course of a minute, you're like, holy cow, this is incredible. That wasn't that long ago. The technology and the ability to use the technology moves so quickly. So that's why putting as much fiber in the ground as we can is important, because that's our best opportunity to future-proof our broadband networks.
Well, Nick, I want to say thank you very much for taking some time to talk to me too. I'm sure you're very busy. Good luck on your trip out there to speak to some more communities and find out more. And thanks for just informing a little bit more too about what's going on with this, because I know it's a big concern for a lot of people, and for some people they may not even be aware of the concern. If you live in an area where you have high-speed internet, you don't think about it, but it's a big issue. And thanks so much for spending some time with us here.
Thanks, Greg. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, there we go. Again, talking about that, access to high-speed internet, definitely a big issue. So you can find out more about that at kptv.com. All right, this is Fox 12 Now. I'm Greg Nibbler. We're going to take a quick break here. We're going to hop off for just a few minutes. So you want to stick around, because coming up at 2 p.m., Mark Nelson is going to be joining me, and we're going to be talking about the Fox 12 Weather video podcast making its debut on Fox 12 Now. So we're going to be playing that for you. You don't want to miss that. So wherever you're at, sit right there. We'll be right back here in a few minutes.